even if it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, it would have been the opinion of only one Tana. Now, what makes Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai such a special character in our history is that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin ruled everything into existence by vote. And one principle is that the Sanhedrin only has authority on practical issues, what we call halacha l'maisa, not what you believe, not an issue that deals with nister, with anything secretive. Now, they make a lot of statements that deal with mystical issues, but like it's neither here or there. However, Torah lo b'shamayim he means that the authority was given to the Sanhedrin as per Parshat Shoftim. This is the way like I learned it. That in all matters of dispute, in terms of what you do, not what you believe, the court had authority. I wanted to introduce you the Rambam's methodology to understanding the oral law, which would definitely invalidate every rabbi today, because every rabbi today, including myself, is a fake rabbi. Real smicha disappeared around the 3rd century of the Common Era. And like Maimonides says, that the authority of the oral law comes from the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin essentially went by different names, like the Shoftim, the Zakanim, the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, and then eventually the Sanhedrin. It was the same court, we believe in faith, that God told Moses to create when he told him to establish a court of 70 elders, 71 with himself. And there was this authority to judge that was passed down from teacher to student that was known as smicha, that in order to be able to come to some conclusion, the Sanhedrin needed at least one person who had this proper ordination going back to Moses, and this ordination ceased to exist in around the 3rd century of the Common Era. And everyone nowadays who calls himself a rabbi, in some way sports that title, because in the 16th century in Sfat, there was a rabbi called the Mari Rav who tried to reinstitute smicha, but he wasn't successful because the truth is the Talmud never told us how to reinstitute smicha, so he was going off the opinion of the Rambam. And he created the ceremonial smicha we have nowadays, and people like me and people who learn in yeshiva, whatever, could call themselves rabbi, but we really don't have the authority to put people to death or fine people money for any Torah infraction. But that's a distinction that still Kabbalists choose not to make because they don't have this systematic theology that appears in the Rambam.
Right. And it's interesting, like the concept of lineage in Judaism. I mean, it is a complete faith claim to say that there was even a continuous line from Yoshua to the first century rabbis. I mean, that's already a faith claim because we know that the temple was corrupted. We know that they were Greek and then Roman installed vassals, the Kohanim. This is interesting. I pointed this out to somebody. Rabbi Singer is very into his being a Kohen. He brings it up fairly often. And I don't mean to dig at him too much here, but it's just funny because it is a very lineage-based, ethnocentric idea. The Levites today are very likely descended from the Levites, right? Just like most Jews today in some way are descendant in all likelihood on at least one familial line back to Judeans from the 1st century, if not maybe a little bit earlier who branched out earlier or so on, maybe a little bit later. There's some lineage going back there, which is not very important when you actually think about what the message of the Torah actually is. Because in biblical times, obviously, moving into and living with the people of Israel and following the laws is what made you a convert, not some ceremony. As you'd probably agree with, I'm sure. But
no, well, I mean, I believe the Sanhedrin had the authority to like establish checks and balances.
I'm talking about the time of like Ruth,
Oh, well, even I mean, I believe the court still existed, so there had to be some sense of order. So
on a faith-based notion, you would believe that
based on faith,
there was a court there still validating those converts. Correct. So what's interesting though is that the Kohanim specifically are very unlikely today in any way to be descended from the original priesthood. The only group of Jews whose lineage is unlikely to be back to their original lineage. To the claim of the original lineage, because that priesthood was completely fabricated, falsified, all kinds of stuff with the Romans and the Greeks. It was an installed priesthood. Some of them were probably legitimate, and those were probably the ones that were very anti the rabbis in the 1st century and so on, and had conflict there because they were probably very Torah literalist, genuine priests from that lineage that didn't like that it was all going on. But it was a corrupt priesthood. Like everyone knows it's a corrupt priesthood. That's historical knowledge. So it's funny that Kohanim specifically today, our priesthood that are supposed to be in the redemption doing these sacrifices for us, are unlikely even descendant from the original Kohanim at all.
Yeah, no, for sure every Kohen is a Suffolk Kohen, just like every Jew technically is a Suffolk Jew. I mean, no one No one knows, right? Now there's this notion of teku, right? That when Mashiach comes, like he'll tell us. I'm not convinced of this idea, but that also tells you that we're not convinced that everyone claims to be who they claim to be, but they go off something called chazaka. So chazaka is like if you have some understanding, some communal understanding, you have people who could vouch for your claim, then you could claim to be a Cohen, which nowadays doesn't mean much. You get the first Aliyah, you could duchen. Um, you get the best the shidduch world has to offer when it comes to looking for a wife, just because they know, like I'm sure Tovia Singer has experienced, that older Kohanim who are divorced have a hard time remarrying because their criteria of the women that they're able to be with is quite small.
I never thought about that at all in my entire life until this moment just now.
Yeah, no, it's a reality.
That's funny.
No,
I didn't even think of that. They know that they're unlikely to be divorced. So
it's interesting. I've met many Kohanim. I don't know, this is wrong to say, but many of them live a kind of decrepit existence sexually because of the stringency that's put on the life of a Cohen on who they can or cannot marry. They typically find themselves just sleeping around with random women because it's so difficult for them, right? So there's actually ways to, in some way, poskin the kahuna away. And I think it's almost an admirable thing that it's probably better for a Cohen I'm not saying this is a halachic thing, but it's done to in some way get someone to, like a rabbi, a posek, not that I acknowledge that the position exists, to say that you're not a Cohen just so you could live a decent existence with a woman that you could call your wife instead of just sleeping around or shacking up with a woman just because you can't legally marry her, because then your kids, in case you have kids, would be mahalal, would not be Kohanim. It's probably better to lose the lineage than to in some way live like an unethical existence, just shacking up with women because you can't find.
I had no idea that was even a thing.
Yeah, unfortunately it is. What are you gonna do?
So that's an interesting. I have never thought about it that way. Like I didn't know that was a thing at all. So how do you get to, if the Talmud is a source document and the Rambam is a good guide to how to think, and the Shulchan Aruch is let's call it optional to an extent, right? I'm assuming from your view, based on what you've said so far, that it's not necessarily a definitive guide to how to follow Jewish law. Where do you derive, because you're an Orthodox rabbi, where do you derive halacha for your congregation, your community, your people? Okay. Where do you get to that?
So Shulchan Aruch is not an optional work. Shulchan Aruch is essentially 90% Rambam. Shulchan Aruch is an abridgment of a greater work called the Beit Yosef, which was an attempt made by Rav Yosef Karo to codify or compile halacha. So he took the best out of the three major codifiers of that era, which is the Rif, the Rosh, and the Rambam. And he basically took the best out of three. So on any particular issue, if the Rif and the Rambam agree and the Rosh disagree, like he would hold like the Rif and the Rambam. So that means 90% of Shulchan Aruch is Mishnah Torah, essentially, of the Rambam. The difference is Shulchan Aruch is a compilation of Jewish law, while Mishnah Torah is a codification of Jewish law. A compilation means that he fed off other codifications, and a codification means that he went into source material and he extracted actual do's and don'ts, and left out all the fluff, i.e., like all the folklore and legend, midrash, and agadah. So the Talmud essentially is not authoritative. It's the first part of the Talmud that's authoritative. It's called the Mishnah. The Gemara, which is the other part of the Talmud, is a commentary on the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is the same in Talmud Yerushalmi and Talmud Bavli. The Gemara that appears in the Scholars of Babylon versus those in Israel, that was them trying to extract practical law from how they understood the Mishnah. But the Mishnah is the actual oral law. I don't like the term oral law. It's not a term that ever appears in the Mishnah, by the way. It's a later term. I mean, the concept is still there, with the idea that the rulings of the Sanhedrin carry weight is a real thing in Jewish law, but the Sanhedrin only exists in the Mishnah. The rabbis in the Mishnah had what's called smicha. Amoraim, which are the rabbis who comment on the Mishnah, by definition, don't have smicha. There were rabbis in Babylon and in Eretz Yisrael who lived at a time when smicha didn't exist. So anything they bring to the table is only opinion. They could only disagree with the Mishnah if they're quoting a brisa, which is like another Mishnaic work that didn't make it into the actual text of the Mishnah. The Rambam just broke this all down systemically. He justifies what we call the oral law from the Torah on the basis that God tells us to listen to this court. Basically, that there has to be some sense of consensus. This idea that people would walk around trying to decipher Torah law on their own just means that the nation could never move forward. I'm not talking about ethical laws, right? I mean, how do you treat each other necessarily, but how do you keep ceremonial laws, right? It tells us to keep Shabbos. It doesn't specifically tell us what's a malacha, what's allowed, what's not allowed, but it tells us there's a death penalty for breaking it. So there had to be some consensus. And that consensus is what we, as Orthodox Jews, believe came from the rabbis that appear in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah Berurah could be authoritative if it's just reiterating what appears in the actual Mishnah. But that means that around 80% of what appears in the Talmud is not binding, because it's just the opinions of what they think the Mishnah is saying. And sometimes
they bring up a baraita, though, right? Right. If you look in Masechet Baba Kama, like you're talking about something that could have mythical aspects to it in storytelling that then is being used to justify something practical in halacha. So I bring this point. This is like my favorite one, is just when asked about the animals that you have to pay damages for that you understand are dangerous animals, right? There's a list of snakes and wolves and so on. And there's one, is I forget the order that it comes out in, but there's a bardalis, and he says my bardalis, nifraza, and I forget what the third one is called. But he's saying, well, this is this animal, and this is a female form of the animal, and it's like a hyena basically. And he says, what is the difference between a male and a female hyena? Because they're talking about practical issue of if you have to pay damages, if your, I guess, pet hyena damages somebody's flock or whatever else it is. But the difference is, well, the male of the species, after 7 years, turns into, I think it's first is arpad, and then is like it's a bat, and then it's like a blood-sucking bat, and then it's a thistle or a thorn, and then it's a tree, and then it turns into a demon. Each one in 7-year time periods. And that's the justification for why one is male, why it's important to give the distinction of male and female on this animal there. And then the Talmud is supposed to be using some kind of exegetical process to get this from Torah, why you think that. But they go to another rabbi's opinion. Well, how do we know that a hyena turns into a bat after 7 years and then into a demon and so on? Well, because just like your spine turns into a snake after 7 years after you die, if you didn't bow properly at the Modi'im prayer. And it's like, have you ever seen, what's it called? Monty Python, The Quest for the Holy Grail? And they want to burn the witch. And they're like, well, how do you know she's a witch? Well, was she burned? Well, then, well, what else burns? It's wood. And well, wood floats. So how do you determine it? Well, what else floats? A duck. So if we put her on a scale next to a duck and they're the same weight, then she's a witch. And it's like, that's what that feels like reading portions of the Talmud.